In the spring of 1997, I was asked to assist with something that didn't fit neatly into any duty description I'd ever been handed. The request came from a county sheriff's office in southern Utah, not from the Park Service, not from the Forest Service, not from any federal agency I'd worked under. A deputy named Carla Beckman had driven 4 hours to meet me at a district office in Richfield, which alone told me something about how seriously she was taking whatever she'd found. People don't make that kind of drive for a consultation they can handle by phone. If you find yourself coming back to these stories, you might consider subscribing. I don't say that often, but it helps me keep sharing these accounts with people who want to hear them. Carla was about 40, compact, deliberate in how she moved and spoke. She had a manila folder, a rolled topographic map, and a plastic evidence bag she didn't open right away. She shook my hand, sat down across from me at the borrowed desk, and started talking without small talk. 3 years ago, she said, a family of 4 disappeared during a road trip through southern Utah. Parents and 2 children, Michael and Sandra Rennick, ages 39 and 36. Daughters Olivia and June, ages 11 and 7. I nodded. The name was vaguely familiar. In that part of the country, missing persons cases occasionally circulated between agencies, especially when they involved national parks or the vast stretches of BLM land between them. They left Flagstaff on June 14, 1994, heading north. Confirmed stops at a gas station in Page, Arizona, and a motel outside Kanab. They had reservations at a campground in Capitol Reef for June 16th through 19th. Never checked in. The vehicle, a dark green 1991 Ford Explorer, was never located. No credit card activity after Kanab. No confirmed sightings after the motel clerk. She opened the manila folder and slid a photocopied map across the desk. Someone had drawn a route in red marker Flagstaff to Page to Kanab, and then a series of dashed lines radiating northeast from Kanab into the Canyonlands, each one labeled with a date and a search descriptor. Ground Team, Aerial, K-9 Unit, Civil Air Patrol. We searched for 6 weeks, Carla said. The Park Service assisted for the first 2. After that, it was us and volunteers. We covered every road, every pullout, every trailhead parking area between Kanab and Hanksville. We flew grids over the Escalante drainage. We checked every canyon rim accessible by vehicle. Nothing. She paused. That was 1994. The case went cold. Then 3 weeks ago, a geology student on a university field trip found this. She placed the evidence bag on the desk. Inside was a child's shoe, a small white sneaker, faded to a grayish yellow, with a frayed pink lace still threaded through the eyelets. The rubber sole had separated partially from the canvas upper. The shoe had been exposed to weather for a long time. Size 12 toddler, Carla said. Consistent with a younger daughter, it was found in a slot canyon drainage about 14 miles east of Escalante, lodged in a sandstone alcove approximately 11 feet above the current wash floor. I looked at the shoe for a long moment. 11 feet above the wash floor, I repeated. Yes. Flash flood deposit. That was my first thought too. But the alcove faces away from the drainage direction. The opening is lateral, a horizontal crack in the canyon wall, maybe 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. The shoe was inside, near the back. The geology student only found it because she was photographing cross-bedding patterns and put her headlamp into the crack. Could water have pushed it in there during a flood event? Possibly. Flood dynamics in slot canyons can do strange things, but the alcove is dry. The sandstone around it shows no water staining consistent with recent immersion. And the geology professor who was supervising the field trip said the alcove position was his word, unlikely as a natural depositional site. She let that sit. But here's the part that made me drive to Richfield. Carla unrolled the topographic map. It was a standard USGS quad sheet, 1 to 24,000 scale, showing a section of the Escalante River drainage and its tributary canyons. She pointed to a spot she'd marked with a small red circle. This is where the shoe was found. Neon Canyon Tributary System, East Fork. I knew the area in general terms. The Escalante canyons are a labyrinth. Hundreds of miles of narrow, deep, branching sandstone corridors, many of them accessible only on foot, and only if you know exactly where you're going. Some sections go years between human visits. It's the kind of terrain where a vehicle could leave a road, drop into a wash, and not be seen again until the next 100-year flood rearranged the sediment. After the geology student reported the shoe, we sent a 2-person team into the canyon to do a preliminary survey. They found it confirmed the location, photographed the alcove, collected the shoe for evidence. But while they were in the canyon, one of them noticed something else. She pointed to a second mark on the map, about 3/4 of a mile deeper into the tributary. At this location, the canyon narrows to a section roughly 4 feet wide. The walls are maybe 120 feet high. Almost no direct sunlight reaches the floor. My deputy, a man named Alan Hirsch, who's been doing backcountry search and rescue in this county for 15 years, found markings on the canyon wall, scratched into the sandstone at adult hand height. What kind of markings? Short horizontal lines, groups of 5-4 vertical with a diagonal cross mark, tally marks. Alan counted 47 of them. The room was quiet for a moment. 47 tally marks, I said. In a canyon that, according to every record we have, nobody visits. No trail register entry for that tributary. No permits. The nearest maintained trail is 9 miles away. And you want to know if the marks are connected to the family. I want to know what's in that canyon. I've already requested mutual aid from the Park Service, but their search and rescue teams are committed to a technical rescue operation near the Maze District for at least another week. State SAR is available but doesn't have anyone with extended slot canyon experience. I need someone who can spend 3 to 5 days in that drainage doing a systematic physical search and who has the backcountry judgment to manage the risk. She looked at me directly. Your name came from 2 different people when I started making calls. They both said the same thing, that you'd been through terrain like this before and that you wouldn't cut the search short just because conditions got difficult. I told her I'd need 24 hours to clear my current assignment and arrange the logistics. She said that was fine. She also said she wanted to send Alan Hirsch with me, both because he knew the access route and because he'd been the one to find the tally marks and could lead me directly to them. I agreed. A 2-person team was appropriate for this kind of work, enough for safety, small enough for mobility in slot canyons, where you sometimes move single file for hours. Before Carla left, I asked one more question. The family, the Rennicks, what did the original investigation conclude? Officially, the case remains open. Unofficially, the prevailing theory was that they drove off a remote road somewhere between Kanab and Capitol Reef, went into a canyon or ravine, and the vehicle was buried by subsequent erosion or flash flooding. It's happened before out there. A vehicle goes off the road in a wash, a summer monsoon comes through, and 20 tons of sand and gravel cover it in a single afternoon. But you don't fully accept that theory. She gathered her folder and the evidence bag. The Explorer had a full-size spare, a CB radio, a first aid kit, and enough camping gear for a week. Michael Rennick was a mechanical engineer. Sandra Rennick had grown up spending summers on her grandfather's ranch outside Moab. These weren't inexperienced people who wandered off a cliff. She paused at the door. And now there's a child's shoe 14 miles east of anywhere they were supposed to be, sitting in a crack in the wall 11 feet above a wash floor, and 47 tally marks scratched into sandstone in a canyon that nobody visits. She left. I sat with the topographic map for a while. I'd worked search and rescue operations in canyon country before. I understood the terrain, both its physical difficulty and its capacity to keep secrets. The Escalante drainage alone contains thousands of side canyons, many of them unnamed, unmapped at any useful resolution, and essentially unexplored. A person could be a quarter-mile from you in one of those canyons, and you'd never know it. Sound doesn't carry the way you'd expect. Line of sight disappears 20 feet in any direction. The sandstone absorbs and redirects everything: light, heat, noise, even smell. It is beautiful country, and it is indifferent country, and it has held on to things for centuries without any particular interest in giving them back. I spent the next day preparing. I pulled the original missing persons file through an interagency records request. It arrived by fax that evening. 46 pages of reports, interview transcripts, search logs, and a handful of photographs. I read the entire file twice. The Rennick family had left their home in Tempe, Arizona, on June 13, 1994, for what Sandra's sister described as a canyon country loop. A 12-day road trip through northern Arizona and southern Utah, hitting national parks and monuments along the way. They had a loose itinerary: Grand Canyon North Rim, then Page, then Kanab, then Capitol Reef, then a few days in Moab before looping back through Monument Valley. Sandra had apparently done a version of this trip as a teenager and wanted to share it with the girls. The last confirmed sighting was the Kanab Motel. The clerk remembered them because Olivia, the older daughter, had asked about a swimming pool, and the clerk had felt bad telling her they didn't have one. He recalled Michael Rennick studying a road map in the lobby and asking about road conditions on Highway 12 toward Escalante. The clerk told him the highway was paved and in good shape. After that, nothing. The search had focused on the highway corridor between Kanab and Capitol Reef, expanding outward to include side roads and trailhead parking areas. The Ford Explorer was never located. No personal belongings were found. No campfire remains. No tire tracks on any of the primitive roads that were checked. No indication that anyone matching the family's description had been seen at any of the small towns, gas stations, or outfitters along the route. It was as though they had driven out of Kanab and into the landscape itself. I packed carefully. Slot canyon work requires specific preparation. Everything must be waterproof, compact, and secured to your body, because you can encounter water at any time, and there are sections where you're swimming with your pack above your head. I brought a 5-day food supply, 2 methods of water purification, a 120-foot static rope, a basic rack of cams and stoppers for anchoring, a harness, a helmet, 2 headlamps with extra batteries, and a personal locator beacon. I also brought a 35mm camera with 5 rolls of film, an evidence collection kit, and a handheld GPS unit that I trusted about 60% in canyon environments where satellite reception was intermittent at best. I met Alan Hirsch at the Escalante Interagency office the following morning. He was younger than I'd expected, early 30s, lean, with a sun-darkened face, and the careful way of moving that people develop after years of working on sandstone, where the wrong foot placement on a slick rock slope sends you sliding toward a drop you can't stop. He wore trail runners instead of boots common among experienced canyon travelers, who need grip and flexibility more than ankle support. His pack was well organized and compact, He'd clearly done this before. We sat in the parking lot with the topo map spread across the tailgate of his truck and went over the route. "The access point is here," he said, indicating a spot on the map about 4 miles south of the hole in the rock road. "There's a stock trail, barely visible, that drops off the rim into the drainage. It's about an 800-foot descent over maybe a third of a mile. Loose sand and slick rock, not technical but not casual either." "And from the drainage floor to the shoe location?" "About 6 miles of canyon walking. The first 4 are relatively open white sandy floor, some cottonwood groves, shallow water in places. Then the canyon narrows, and you start getting into the slot sections. The shoe was found in the second major slot section, roughly here." He tapped the map. "And the tally marks?" "Deeper, about 3/4 of a mile past the shoe site. The canyon makes a hard left bend, narrows to about 4 feet, and the walls go vertical. The marks are on the east wall, about 5 feet off the floor." "What's beyond the tally marks?" Alan hesitated, not long, but enough for me to notice. "I don't know." I turned around at the tally marks. The canyon continues, but it gets narrower, and there was standing water I couldn't gauge the depth of. I was alone, and I'd already exceeded the distance I'd planned for. So I documented the marks and came back. That was the right call. I know it was. But I need to tell you something about that section, because it's going to sound like I'm making it up. And I want to say it here in a parking lot in daylight, instead of waiting until we're in there. I told him to go ahead. When I was at the tally marks, I spent about 10 minutes photographing them and sketching the layout in my notebook. The whole time, I had this sense, and I know how this sounds, that the acoustics were wrong. I've been in dozens of slot canyons. You learn what they sound like. Your footsteps echo in a particular way. Your breathing reflects off the walls. Water sounds a certain way, depending on the width and depth of the passage. I know those sounds the way you know the sounds in your own house." He folded his arms. "At the tally marks, the sound was wrong. Not louder, not quieter, just wrong. Like the space I was hearing didn't match the space I was seeing. My footsteps sounded like they were echoing off walls that were farther away than the ones I could touch with my hands. And once, just once, I heard something that sounded like a breath. Not mine, not an echo of mine. A separate breath, from deeper in the canyon, past the standing water." He looked at me. "I'm telling you this, not because I think something supernatural is happening in a slot canyon in Utah. I'm telling you because I've been in enough canyons to know what my own echoes sound like, and that wasn't one." I appreciated the honesty. In my experience, the people most worth trusting in the backcountry are the ones who report what they observed without trying to attach a conclusion to it. Alan wasn't claiming anything about what the sound was. He was telling me that the sound didn't fit what he knew, and he was letting me make my own assessment. We left his truck at the rim access point and started down at 7:15 in the morning. The descent was exactly as he described, steep but manageable. A series of sandy chutes and sandstone ledges that required constant attention but no ropes. The air was cool at the rim and warmed quickly as we dropped below the canyon edge, the way it always does in southern Utah. In spring, the rock absorbs heat from the moment the sun touches it and radiates it back at you from every surface. By 9 o'clock, we were on the canyon floor. The lower drainage was wide and quiet. A shallow stream, maybe 2 inches deep and a few feet across, threaded down the center of a sandy wash, appearing and disappearing as the terrain shifted. Cottonwood trees grew in clusters where the water was more consistent, their new spring leaves bright green against the red and cream sandstone. The walls rose gradually as we walked, from maybe 40 feet at the canyon's mouth to over 100 feet within the first 2 miles. Bird sounds were constant canyon wrens with their distinctive descending call. A few swifts high above us working the insect columns near the rim. We moved at a steady pace, but not a fast one. I was scanning methodically every alcove, every lateral crack, every section of wall where something might have lodged or been placed. Alan did the same on the opposite side. We didn't talk much. There wasn't much to say yet. The work was observation, and observation requires quiet. At about the 4-mile mark, the canyon began to change character. The walls tightened. The stream channel cut deeper into the sandstone floor, forming a narrow groove that we walked beside rather than in. The cottonwoods disappeared. Vegetation thinned to occasional clumps of moss on the damp north-facing wall, and a few hanging ferns in high alcoves where seep water trickled down the rock face. The sky above us narrowed from a wide blue band to a jagged bright line. The air changed too. Cooler, humid, carrying a mineral smell wet sandstone, which has a specific scent that anyone who spent time in canyon country recognizes. Clean and ancient, like the rock is exhaling something it's held for millions of years. We reached the first slot section by midday. Here the canyon compressed to roughly 8 feet wide, with walls that rose sheer and smooth on both sides, sculpted by millennia of flowing water into curved, flowing shapes. The light that reached the floor was indirect, bounced off the upper walls in warm, amber tones that shifted constantly as the sun moved. Walking through a deep slot canyon in good conditions is one of the more remarkable experiences available on public land. The scale of it silences most people. Alan stopped and pointed. The shoe alcove is about 400 yards ahead. Right-hand wall. You'll see a horizontal crack about 11 feet up. Looks like a dark line in the sandstone. That's where it was. We reached it in 10 minutes. The crack was exactly as Carla had described, a horizontal gap in the canyon wall, roughly 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall, positioned well above head height. The sandstone around it was smooth and unblemished. No water staining, no debris trail leading up to it, no obvious mechanism by which a small shoe could have traveled from the canyon floor to that specific opening. I studied the wall carefully. Slot canyon walls in this kind of Navajo sandstone are often scalable. The rock is textured enough that an experienced climber can sometimes chimney or friction climb short sections. An adult could potentially reach that alcove by climbing. A child could not. And a shoe deposited by floodwater would typically be found in a debris pile at an obstruction point. A logjam, a chockstone, a narrowing of the canyon not placed neatly in a lateral crack. "I want to check the alcove interior," I said. We rigged a simple anchor from a cam placement in a crack above the alcove, and I climbed up on a short section of rope. The alcove was shallow, about 3 feet deep, with a floor of dry, fine sand. I swept my headlamp across it. The shoe's impression was still visible in the sand. And beside it, partially covered, was something else. A small plastic barrette, pink with a molded flower shape, the kind a young girl might wear. I photographed it in place, collected it in an evidence bag, and descended. Alan looked at the bag and didn't say anything for a long moment. "That wasn't there when we collected the shoe," he finally said. "You checked the full alcove?" "My deputy did. He put his headlamp in there, looked around, and said the shoe was the only item. He photographed it. I have the photos. There's nothing else in the alcove in those images." We looked at each other. "How long ago was that?" I asked. 11 days. 11 days. In a slot canyon that by all available evidence received almost no human traffic. And in those 11 days, a child's barrette had appeared in the same alcove where the shoe had been found. an alcove 11 feet above the wash floor, in a crack that faced away from the drainage and showed no signs of water deposition. I sealed the evidence bag and put it in the hard case inside my pack. We continued deeper into the canyon. The slot narrowed further. In places, we turned sideways to pass through, our packs scraping both walls simultaneously. The stream reappeared as a shallow flow along the floor, cold against our feet. The light dimmed as the walls climbed higher and closer together until we were walking in a kind of perpetual twilight, warm toned from the sandstone, but deeply shadowed, with the sky reduced to a bright crack far above us that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. The sound changed too. Our footsteps in the shallow water produced a flat, contained echo that bounced between the walls and came back slightly altered in timing, a quarter-second delay that made it sound as though someone was walking just behind us, matching our pace. I knew this was a normal acoustic property of narrow canyons. I'd experienced it before in other slot systems, but knowing the explanation didn't entirely remove the sensation. At 1:30 in the afternoon, we reached the bend Alan had described. The canyon turned sharply left, the walls tightening to approximately 4 feet apart. The sandstone here was darker, a deep burgundy color, stained by mineral deposits from centuries of water contact. The stream pooled in a depression in the floor, standing water about a foot deep and perfectly still. And on the east wall, at roughly 5 feet above the floor, were the tally marks, 47 of them, scratched into the sandstone with something harder than fingernail, a rock, a piece of metal, a knife blade. They were organized in standard groups of 5, 4 vertical lines crossed by a diagonal, 9 complete groups, and 2 additional marks. I stood in front of them and counted twice. 47. Then I photographed them from multiple angles and distances, using a pencil held against the wall for scale. I examined the scratches closely with my headlamp. The marks were weathered. The edges of the scratches had softened slightly, the way sandstone does when exposed to intermittent moisture over time. These weren't fresh. They'd been here for at least a year, probably longer. The consistency of the weathering across all 47 marks suggested they'd all been made within a relatively narrow time frame, not accumulated gradually over many visits. Someone had stood in this spot and scratched 47 marks into the wall. All at once, or close to it. 47 days. That was the obvious interpretation. Someone counting days. I looked past the tally marks, deeper into the canyon. Beyond the standing water, the slot continued a dark, narrow corridor, curving out of sight to the right. The walls were close enough that I could touch both simultaneously. The water's surface was motionless. The air was still, cool, and carried that same wet mineral smell, though stronger here, concentrated by the tight walls and lack of air movement. I listened. Canyon acoustics are complex. In a slot this narrow, even small sounds reflect unpredictably. Water dripping from a seep 50 yards away can sound like it's next to your ear. Your own breathing becomes a presence, bouncing back at you with a slight tonal shift imposed by the rock. I heard our breathing. I heard the faint, irregular drip of seep water somewhere ahead. I heard a distant, papery sound that was probably wind moving across the rim far above us. And under all of that, at the very edge of what I could resolve, I heard something rhythmic, not mechanical, not like a heartbeat or a footstep, more like the slow, repeated compression of air in a confined space, a soft, aspirated pulse, maybe once every 4 or 5 seconds. I looked at Alan. He was listening too. His expression told me he was hearing it, That's what I heard before, he said quietly. How far in does the canyon go past this point? I don't know. Nobody I've talked to has been past the water. It's not in any of the canyoneering route descriptions. The guidebooks for this drainage all stop well before this section. I knelt and tested the standing water with my trekking pole. It was about 14 inches deep at the near edge. The bottom was firm sandstone, no silt, no mud, no uncertain footing. I couldn't see how deep it got farther in because the light failed within about 20 feet. It was 1:45 in the afternoon. We had roughly 5 hours of functional daylight left, though in a deep slot canyon. The concept of daylight was relative. We'd been in shade since entering the narrow sections. We had headlamps, we had rope, we had the skills and equipment to continue. What I didn't have was a clear sense of what was ahead. I made the decision to stop here for now. We would make camp in the wider section of canyon we'd passed through earlier, back near the cottonwood groves where there was flat ground and some remaining daylight on the canyon floor, and return to this point in the morning, rested and with a full day ahead of us. Alan didn't argue. I think he was relieved. We marked the tally mark location on both our maps and began the walk back to the wider section. The return was easier downstream, with the current rather than against it, and through terrain we'd already assessed. We found a good campsite on a sandbar beneath a cluster of cottonwoods, about 2.5 miles back from the tally marks. The sand was dry and level. The canyon walls here were far enough apart that we'd have direct sunlight for another hour, and the open sky above meant reasonable GPS reception for an evening position fix. We set up camp efficiently: ground pads, sleeping bags, a small stove for boiling water. The evening was warm and still. A great horned owl called from somewhere up canyon as the light faded. The stream murmured past our campsite, shallow enough that we could hear individual pebbles shifting in the current. Over a meal of rehydrated soup and crackers, I asked Alan about the original search. I wasn't part of it, he said. I'd only been with the sheriff's office for a year at that point. But I've read the file. They were thorough. The problem is, there's just too much ground out here. You could search for a decade and still miss a canyon. Most of these side drainages have never had a human being in them. Did the original search come anywhere near this canyon? No. The search grid was focused on the highway corridor and the maintained roads. This drainage is what, 14 miles from the nearest road? The family's vehicle was never found, so the assumption was that wherever they were, the vehicle was too. And you're not getting a Ford Explorer within 10 miles of where we are right now. That was true. The terrain between the nearest road and this canyon was trackless slick rock, sand, and sage, passable on foot but not by vehicle, not even a high-clearance four-wheel drive, which raised a question I'd been carrying since Carla's office. If the Rennick family's vehicle never left the road system, how did a child's shoe and a barrette end up 14 miles into the backcountry in a slot canyon accessible only on foot? And who scratched 47 tally marks into the wall of that canyon? I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the stream and the owl, and the slow tick of cooling sandstone. The air smelled like cottonwood and dust, and the faintly metallic edge that water carries when it's passed through miles of iron-bearing rock. Above us, the strip of sky visible between the canyon walls showed stars in a thick, bright band, the Milky Way running roughly north-south, aligned with the canyon's orientation. I thought about the barrette. I thought about the fact that it had appeared in the alcove after the initial evidence collection. 11 days. Someone or something had placed it there in the interval between the first visit and ours. There were rational explanations. Another hiker could have found the barrette elsewhere in the canyon, and placed it in the alcove, recognizing the site from news coverage or word of mouth. But there had been no news coverage. The shoe discovery had been kept within the sheriff's office, pending further investigation. And the canyon saw almost no traffic. An animal could have carried it. Pack rats, in particular, are notorious for collecting small objects and caching them in rock crevices. A pack rat could physically carry a barrette. But pack rats also leave obvious sign droppings, nesting material, urine stains on the rock. The alcove had been clean. I kept turning possibilities over without settling on one. That's how real investigation works. You don't force a conclusion. You hold the question open and keep gathering evidence until the conclusion finds you. Sometime around midnight, I came awake. Not with a start, just a gradual return to full awareness. The way you wake when some part of your brain has registered a change in your environment before your conscious mind catches up. I lay still and listened. The stream, the owl, now silent. A faint breeze moving through the cottonwood leaves above us. And from somewhere up canyon, from the direction of the slot, the tally marks, the dark, narrow corridor beyond the standing water sound. Not the rhythmic compression I'd heard earlier. This was different, clearer, a voice. Distant, distorted by the canyon walls, broken into fragments by the acoustics of the rock, but unmistakably a human voice. High-pitched, brief. A single vocalization that lasted maybe 2 seconds, bounced off the sandstone, and was gone. It sounded like a child. I sat up. Across the campsite, Alan was already sitting up too. He was looking at me. "You heard that," he said. "Yes." "From up canyon." "Yes." We listened for another 20 minutes. The sound did not repeat. The canyon settled back into its ambient noise water, wind, the faint clicks and pops of rock adjusting to the nighttime temperature drop. Neither of us slept well after that. At first light, we ate quickly and broke camp. The morning air in the canyon was cool and still, holding the faint dampness that collects overnight in narrow sandstone corridors where the rock releases moisture it absorbed during the previous day's heat. A thin mist hung at ankle level over the stream. Not fog exactly, just the visible boundary between cold water and warming air. Neither of us had mentioned the sound again since hearing it. That wasn't avoidance. It was professional restraint. We both knew that canyon acoustics could carry and distort sounds over remarkable distances. A coyote vocalization from a side drainage 2 miles away, bounced through the right sequence of rock surfaces, could arrive at your ears sounding like almost anything. Wind moving through a narrow crack in a high wall could produce tones that the human brain, especially a tired human brain, expecting nothing, would pattern match to a voice. I'd heard similar things before in canyon country, sounds that seemed human but weren't. The desert is full of them. Your mind, operating on too little sleep in an unfamiliar environment, reaches for the most emotionally significant interpretation. That's not weakness. That's neurology. But Alan had heard it too, and he hadn't said it sounded like a coyote. We packed our gear for a full day of exploration, all water, food, rope, climbing hardware, headlamps, evidence kit, camera, and the personal locator beacon I carried on every backcountry assignment. I made a radio check before we left. Reception was poor in the canyon, but I got a broken acknowledgement from the Escalante interagency office. Enough to confirm the radio was functional, even if we couldn't count on it for reliable communication from deep in the slot. We retraced our route from the previous day. The canyon narrowed progressively, and by mid-morning, we were back in the deep slot section's walls 100 feet high, 4 to 8 feet apart. The sky a luminous crack above us. The sandstone glowed with reflected light in shades of amber, rust, and cream. The stream threaded along the floor, sometimes 6 inches deep, sometimes just a dark stain on the rock. I stopped at the shoe alcove on the way past, climbed up on the rope we'd left rigged from the day before, and checked the interior again. A second barrette. This one was blue, with a small plastic butterfly shape. It sat on the sand floor of the alcove, roughly 6 inches from where the pink one had been. The sand around it was undisturbed, no tracks, no drag marks, no sign that an animal had entered the space. I photographed it, collected it, and descended without saying anything until my feet were on the canyon floor. "Another one," I said, and showed Alan the evidence bag. He stared at it. I watched his face move through several expressions, confusion, unease, and then a careful professional blankness that I recognized because I'd worn it myself. "We were the last people here," he said. "Yesterday afternoon. There's no one else in this canyon." "I know." "That barrette was not in that alcove yesterday." "I know." "So someone came through here last night, between when we left and now." "That's one possibility. What's another?" I didn't answer, because I didn't have one. Not yet. We continued to the tally marks. They were unchanged 47, same groupings, same weathering pattern. I photographed them again for reference, and then turned my attention to the corridor beyond the standing water. In the daylight, such as it was in this deep section, I could see slightly farther into the passage than I had the day before. The canyon continued past the pool in a gently curving arc to the right, the walls maintaining that 4-foot width and rising sheer on both sides. The standing water was clear, with a sandstone bottom visible through it, and appeared to be no more than 18 inches deep for as far as I could see. I listened. The rhythmic sound from the previous day, that slow, aspirated pulse, was absent. The canyon was quiet, except for the drip of seep water and the small sounds of our breathing and movement. "I want to push past the water and see what's ahead," I said. "At least another half-mile, if the canyon allows it." Alan nodded. He didn't look enthusiastic, but he didn't hesitate either. He adjusted his pack straps and tightened the seal on his dry bag. We waded into the pool. The water was cold, shockingly so after the warmth of the upper canyon. It crept up to mid-calf and stayed there. The bottom was solid. The walls pressed close on either side, and I could feel the temperature drop as we moved deeper into the slot, not just the water, but the air itself, as though we were descending into a space that the sun hadn't reached in a very long time. The pool extended for about 60 feet, and then the floor rose gradually until we were walking on damp sandstone again. The canyon continued to curve right, and as we followed it, the character of the walls changed. The upper sections were still the warm Navajo sandstone, smooth, rounded, sculpted by water into flowing organic shapes. But the lower walls, from roughly chest height down, showed a different texture. Darker, harder. A dense, fine-grained layer that I recognized as the Kayenta Formation, an older geological stratum that sits beneath the Navajo in this part of the Colorado Plateau. The contact line between the two formations ran along both walls like a horizon, undulating slightly with the ancient topography of the original depositional surface. It was beautiful geology. It was also significant, because the Kayenta layer is less permeable than the Navajo. Water that seeps freely through the Navajo sandstone hits the Kayenta and is forced to move laterally, creating springs and seeps along the contact line. This explained the standing water behind us, and it suggested that the canyon ahead might contain more water, possibly deeper. We continued for another 10 minutes, moving carefully. The floor was uneven now. Small ledges, potholes, occasional drops of 2 or 3 feet where the stream had carved steps into the rock. At each drop, I checked the depth of whatever pool lay below before committing. The water varied from ankle deep to waist deep, always cold, always clear. And then the canyon opened. Not dramatically, not into a wide valley or a sunlit amphitheater. It opened the way a hallway opens into a room. The walls stepped back on both sides, widening from 4 feet to maybe 30. The ceiling, because at this point the overhanging walls had converged enough above us that it felt like a ceiling rather than a sky, remained high, perhaps 80 feet. But the wider floor created a space that felt suddenly, unexpectedly habitable. The floor of this wider section was dry sand, pale and fine, undisturbed by any current. The stream had vanished, either seeping into the sand or diverting through some crack we'd passed without noticing. The walls were dark Cayenta sandstone up to about 20 feet, then transitioned to the warmer Navajo above that. Long vertical streaks of desert varnished the dark manganese oxide coating that forms over centuries on exposed rock, ran down the walls like dark curtains. It was cool in here. Not cold, just noticeably cooler than the slot behind us, with a stillness to the air that suggested this space didn't exchange atmosphere with the outside canyon very efficiently. Alan stopped walking. I stopped beside him. On the back wall of this widened space, the farthest wall from us, maybe 25 feet ahead, someone had built a shelter. It wasn't a ruin. It wasn't ancient. It was constructed from materials that were clearly modern nylon fabric. Aluminum poles bent at angles, paracord lashing. A tarp, faded to a pale blue-gray, had been stretched between 2 aluminum trekking poles jammed into cracks in the rock wall, creating an angled roof about 4 feet high. Beneath it, a space roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet deep was partially enclosed by fabric walls made from what appeared to be cut sections of a tent red nylon, frayed at the edges where it had been severed from its original structure. In front of this shelter, arranged on the sand, were objects. A metal pot, small, dented, blackened on the bottom. 2 plastic water bottles, empty, their labels long since peeled or worn away. A child's drawing, done in crayon on a piece of paper that had been folded and placed under a flat stone to keep it from blowing away. Though in this windless space, nothing was blowing anywhere. A pair of adult hiking boots placed neatly side by side. Men's size, maybe 10 or 11. The leather was dried and cracked. And a spiral-bound notebook, the kind you can buy at any drugstore, with a green cover spotted with mildew. I stood completely still for a long moment. The training tells you to stop before entering a scene. Observe first. Contaminate nothing. Preserve everything. Alan was already reaching for his camera. Good. Don't step past this line, I said, and drew a mark in the sand with my boot about 10 feet from the shelter. Photograph everything from here first. Wide shots, then details. I'll sketch the layout. He nodded and began shooting. I pulled out my notebook and drew a rough overhead diagram of the space walls, dimensions, shelter position, object placement. My hand was steady. My pulse was not, because I was looking at a survival camp. Someone had lived in this space. Someone who had trekking poles and a tent and a cooking pot and a notebook. Someone who had placed children's belongings in a crack in the canyon wall, as though preserving them. Someone who had counted 47 days on the wall of a canyon that nobody visits. When Alan finished his initial photography, we approached the shelter together, stepping carefully on the sand, watching for footprints or any other impressions that might constitute evidence. The sand showed no footprints whatsoever. Not around the shelter, not between the objects, not anywhere in the wider chamber. The surface was smooth and uniform, the kind of surface that forms over time in a low-circulation environment where the sand settles completely undisturbed. That fact alone was difficult to reconcile. If someone had been living here using the pot, writing in the notebook, placing objects there should have been extensive disturbance of the sand floor. Footprints in fine dry sand in a windless space don't simply disappear. They remain until something actively redistributes the sand wind, water, or physical smoothing. There was no wind in this chamber. There was no water on this floor. And the sand looked as though it hadn't been touched since it was deposited. I knelt near the shelter entrance and examined the tarp. The nylon was degraded, brittled by time, though protected somewhat from UV exposure by the deep shade of the canyon. I estimated it had been here for at least 2 years based on the fabric condition. Though accurate dating of nylon degradation is difficult without laboratory analysis. The paracord lashing was knotted in simple but functional configurations. Clove hitches, half hitches, a trucker's hitch for tensioning the ridgeline. Practical knots, the kind a person with outdoor experience would use. I turned my attention to the notebook. It sat on the sand about 2 feet from the shelter opening, its cover spotted with mildew, but otherwise intact. I photographed it in place, then put on nitrile gloves and carefully picked it up. The pages were wavy from past moisture exposure, but dry now. I opened to the first page. The handwriting was small, neat, and written in pencil. The first entry had no date. Got the shelter up? Girls are sleeping. Water from the seep on the left wall seems clean, but I'm boiling everything. Knee is worse today. S set the bone as best she could, but it's swelling again. No way I'm climbing out of here on it. Need to think about options. I turned the page. Day 3. Explored downstream. Canyon narrows again past the chamber, couldn't get through. Water too deep and too cold for the girls. Upstream is the way we came in, but the drop we slid down is at least 12 feet of smooth rock. I can't make that climb with a knee, and S can't carry me. She tried to climb it alone to go for help, but couldn't get purchase. The sandstone is too smooth. We need rope or something to use as a handhold, and we don't have either. Day 3. I noted the use of S. Consistent with Sandra Rennick. The girls, 2 daughters. Day 5. O found a seep spring on the right wall near the back of the chamber. Better flow than the left one. Tastes clean. We have the pot and the water bottles, so storage isn't a problem. Food is the problem. We had 3 days of camp food in the packs when we came down here, and that's almost gone. S found some plants growing near the seeps that she thinks are edible maidenhair fern, she says. She grew up around here, and I trust her on plant ID more than I trust myself. I kept reading. The entries continued in a measured, methodical tone. A man trained in problem solving, applying that training to an increasingly desperate situation. Day 8. My knee is not going to heal properly without medical attention. The swelling has stabilized, but I can't bend it past about 30 degrees, and weight-bearing is extremely painful. S has been incredible. She's managing everything: water, food, keeping the girls calm. O is old enough to understand we're in trouble. J thinks we're on an adventure. I'm not correcting either of them. Day 11. Tried to attract attention by sound. S and I both yelled at intervals for about an hour, aiming our voices up toward the canyon rim. The acoustics are strange in here. The sound seems to get absorbed by the walls rather than carrying upward. Hard to believe anyone at the rim could hear us. And who would be at the rim? We haven't seen another person since Canab. I read carefully, turning pages with gloved fingers. The notebook told a story that was both completely logical and deeply painful. The Rennicks had driven from Kanab toward Capitol Reef on Highway 12, stopped at a pullout near the Escalante River crossing to take photographs, and decided to walk a short distance into a side canyon. Michael described it as an impulsive decision. The canyon looked beautiful. The weather was perfect. The girls were restless from driving. They brought their day packs with water and snacks. They walked farther than intended. The canyon drew them in, that's what canyons do. Each bend revealing something more beautiful around the next corner. At some point, they descended a smooth sandstone chute, the kind that's easy to slide down, but impossible to climb back up without equipment. Michael went first, then helped the girls down. Then Sandra came last. It was only after they were all at the bottom that they realized the chute was a one-way passage. The polished sandstone was too smooth and steep to reverse. They continued downstream because they had no other option. The canyon narrowed, then opened into this chamber. Michael injured his knee during the descent. He wasn't specific about how, but the entry about Sandra setting a bone suggested a fracture rather than a sprain. And then they were here. In this room of rock, with water from seep springs but almost no food, with a 12-foot unclimbable chute behind them and a water-filled slot ahead of them that was too cold and too deep for children. They had tried to ration their food. They had tried to signal for help. They had tried repeatedly to find a way out. Each attempt was documented in the notebook with the clarity and precision of an engineer who understood that accurate records might matter later, might be the only way anyone would ever understand what had happened to them. I read 47 daily entries. That number stopped me. 47. The same number as the tally marks on the wall back in the slot. But the tally marks were in the slot canyon, 3/4 of a mile from this chamber. And the notebook entries described a family trapped in this chamber, unable to climb out the way they'd come in and unable to pass through the deep water of the slot. So who had made the tally marks in the slot? I continued reading. Day 34. O is getting thin. We all are. The ferns and the sedge roots S found are keeping us alive, but barely. J cries at night. O doesn't cry anymore, and that worries me more. S says we need to try the water passage again. She wants to swim it alone, go through the slot, get past the deep section, make it to the wider canyon, and walk out. She's a strong swimmer. I told her the water temperature will be hypothermic within minutes. She said she knows. Day 36, S went. She made it past the first deep section. I could hear her moving through the water, then her voice echoing back from farther away, then nothing. I waited with the girls all day. She didn't come back. Day 37, she didn't come back. Day 38. Nothing. O asked me if Mom is dead. I told her Mom went to get help, and sometimes that takes a long time. I don't know if O believed me. J believed me. The entries after day 36 were shorter. The handwriting deteriorated, still legible, but with a shakiness that hadn't been there before. The content shifted from practical problem-solving to something more interior. Not despairing exactly, but quieter. A man sitting in a sandstone chamber with 2 children, waiting for a rescue that depended entirely on whether his wife had survived a swim through a freezing slot canyon and a 14-mile walk through wilderness to a road. Day 41. Marking days on the wall now. Easier than writing. Pencil is getting short. So the tally marks weren't made in the slot by someone who'd walked in from outside. They were made by someone in this chamber, marking days on the nearest flat wall surface, which, given the way the chamber was configured, might well be the section of wall that extended from the chamber back into the slot, depending on how the geology connected. The tally marks I'd seen could be on a wall surface that was accessible from inside the chamber, but positioned in a section of the canyon I'd interpreted as being far from the camp. I needed to verify that. Later. Right now, I needed to finish the notebook. Day 43. Found a way to make the fern roots more palatable. If you pound them flat with a rock and then soak them in water for a few hours, they get softer. Jay will eat them now. O won't eat much of anything. Day 45. O said something last night that I'm writing down because I want there to be a record. She said, "Dad, there's someone at the water." I asked her what she meant. She said she could hear someone in the water at the back of the cave, in the deep part we can't pass through. Breathing. I listened and didn't hear anything. She was very calm about it. She said it wasn't scary. She said it sounded like it was waiting. The air in the chamber was perfectly still. I was aware of my own breathing, the faint sound of Alan's camera shutter behind me, and nothing else. Day 46. I heard it too. That was the entire entry for day 46. Day 47. This will be my last entry. I'm leaving this notebook here so that if anyone finds this place, they'll know we were here and they'll know what happened. My name is Michael Rennick. My wife Sandra left on day 36 to swim out through the canyon and find help. She did not return. My daughters Olivia and June are with me. We have been in this canyon for 47 days. I have decided to do something I would not have considered when we arrived. The water at the back of the chamber has been rising. Not flooding, there's been no rain, and the seep springs haven't changed. But the water level in the deep section at the far end has come up slowly, maybe an inch a day, for the last week. And the water is warmer than it was. When S left, she said the cold was the worst part. Now when I put my hand in, it's tepid, almost comfortable. O says the breathing is clearer now. She says she can hear words in it. I've listened and I can hear the breathing, but I can't make out words. Maybe she can hear frequencies I can't. Children's hearing is better than adults. Everyone knows that. I'm going to take the girls into the water. Not because I think it leads out. I no longer believe it leads anywhere we've been before. But it's warm and the girls aren't afraid of it. And we can't stay here. We can't stay here. The food is gone. Help hasn't come. And something is in the water that wants us to come to it. And after 47 days in this place, I don't have a better option. If you're reading this, I need you to understand I'm not out of my mind. I've been an engineer for 15 years. I solve problems by understanding systems. This water is not behaving like water. It is not following the rules that water follows. And I don't know what that means, but my 11-year-old daughter can hear it speaking, and she is not afraid. And right now, her judgment is the only thing I trust. God forgive me if I'm wrong. That was the last entry. I closed the notebook. Alan had stopped taking photographs at some point while I was reading and was standing a few feet behind me, waiting. I could tell from his silence that he hadn't read over my shoulder. He was respecting the evidence protocol, letting me process the primary document before discussing it. I stood up and faced him. My knees ached from kneeling on the sandstone. "It's them," I said. "The Rennicks. Michael Rennick's journal. 47 days trapped in this chamber. His wife swam out through the slot to get help on day 36 and never came back. On day 47, he took the girls into the water at the back of the chamber. Alan absorbed this. Into the water. Into a deep section at the far end of this space. He describes the water level rising and the temperature changing. And both he and the older daughter heard sounds coming from it. What kind of sounds? Breathing. The daughter said she heard words. Alan looked past me toward the back of the chamber. I turned and looked too. The chamber extended another 20 feet beyond the shelter, narrowing slightly as the walls converged. At the far end, where the walls came close together again, there was water. A dark, still pool that filled the width of the passage, maybe 6 feet across, and extended back into the rock as far as I could see, which wasn't far. The surface was motionless, black in the deep shadow, reflecting nothing. We walked to the edge of the pool. I knelt and touched the water with my fingers. It was warm. Not hot, not geothermally heated, not uncomfortable, just warm. Maybe 80 degrees. In a canyon where every other water source we'd encountered was cold enough to numb your hand in 30 seconds. I pulled my hand out and dried it on my pants. "That's not right," Alan said. He'd touched it too. "There's no geothermal activity in this geology. This is sedimentary sandstone over shale. No volcanism, no hot springs, no source for heated water within 100 miles of here." "I know. So, where's the heat coming from?" I didn't answer, because the honest answer was that I didn't know. And I wasn't going to speculate in a place where speculation could lead to decisions I'd regret. I shone my headlamp across the pool's surface. The beam penetrated about 2 feet into the water before being absorbed. The water was clear, not murky, not silty, but it attenuated light rapidly, as though it were denser than normal water. Below the surface, as far as I could see, the walls continued downward, smooth and featureless. "I need to measure this," I said. I assembled my trekking poles into their full length, about 52 inches, and submerged one vertically into the pool. It went down to the handle without touching bottom. 4 feet, 3 inches, and no bottom. I didn't have anything longer to measure with. The rope would work, but lowering a weighted line into an unknown body of water in a place where 3 people had apparently entered and not emerged was a step I wasn't ready to take without thinking it through. I pulled the pole out and examined it. The wet section looked normal, no discoloration, no residue, no unusual smell, just water, but warm. We retreated to the front of the chamber, near the shelter, and I laid out the situation. "We have a potential crime scene, a survival camp, a primary document, and 3 missing persons whose last known action was entering that pool. We also have evidence the barrettes that's appearing in places it shouldn't be, in time frames that don't make sense. And we have anomalous water behavior that I can't explain with any geology I know." Alan nodded slowly. "What I want to do," I continued, "is catalog everything in this chamber, secure the notebook and all physical evidence, and then make a decision about whether to investigate the pool further or report back and bring in a larger team." "I'd vote for the larger team," Alan said. "I'm inclined that way too, but I want to finish documenting this space first. Every surface, every object, every detail. Because once other people come in here, the scene changes." We spent the next 2 hours conducting a meticulous survey of the chamber. I measured dimensions roughly 30 feet wide at its broadest point, 60 feet long from the entrance pool to the back pool. Ceiling heights varying from 80 feet at the center to about 20 where the walls converged at each end. Alan photographed every surface, every object, every feature. I sketched detailed diagrams and recorded written descriptions of each item. The shelter was constructed with considerable ingenuity. Michael Rennick had used every available material: his trekking poles for structure, the tent fabric for walls, the tarp for roofing, paracord for lashing. The interior was arranged with care. 2 sleeping areas for the children, made from unrolled sleeping pads. A third area, larger, presumably shared by the adults before Sandra left. In the sleeping areas, I found personal items. A small stuffed animal, a rabbit, its fur matted and dusty. A children's book, swollen with moisture damage. Owl Moon by Jane Yolen. A hair tie, a single sock, child-sized, with a faded pattern of stars. These objects affected me more than the notebook had. The notebook was an adult's record, organized, purposeful, designed to communicate. These objects were just the residue of childhood. Things a 7-year-old would have carried in a backpack on a family road trip. Things that would have been held at night in a dark canyon by a child who was scared and hungry and waiting for her mother to come back. I photographed each item, bagged it, and labeled it. Near the shelter, partially buried in the sand, I found something else. A Swiss Army knife, its blade open and stuck in the sand point first, as though it had been placed there deliberately. The blade was clean, but showed scratches consistent with being used to cut nylon fabric, which made sense given the shelter construction. But the placement was odd. Not set down casually, planted, upright. I added it to the evidence collection and noted the position in my diagram. The sand floor, again, showed no footprints anywhere in the chamber. The surface was smooth and undisturbed, except where our own feet had now marked it. Whatever had happened here, however long ago, the sand had settled back to a uniform surface as though no one had ever walked on it. That detail continued to bother me. Fine sand in a sheltered, windless environment should preserve impressions almost indefinitely. I'd seen footprints in protected alcoves in canyon country that were decades old, sometimes centuries. In the case of ancestral Puebloan sites, the absence of any prints in this chamber suggested either that the sand had been deliberately smoothed by someone, or that enough time had passed for some imperceptible air movement to gradually redistribute the surface, or that the people who had been here hadn't left prints. I didn't like that thought, and I set it aside. By early afternoon, we had completed our documentation. The evidence bags were secured in my pack. The notebook was wrapped in a plastic bag inside my hard case. We had photographs, sketches, measurements, and written descriptions of everything we'd found. The question now was the pool. I stood at its edge again and looked into the dark water. Warm air rose from its surface faintly, just barely perceptible against the skin of my face, like standing over a bath that's been cooling for an hour. The water was perfectly still. No current, no ripple, no movement of any kind. Michael Rennick had taken his daughters into this water 47 days after being trapped in this chamber. He had done it because the water was warm, because his daughter heard something in it, and because he was out of options. That was 3 years ago. 3 years. In warm, still water, in a confined space. There should be, I will say this plainly, there should be remains. Decomposition in warm water produces gases that bring bodies to the surface. Within days, the pool was not large enough to conceal that process from anyone present. Whatever had happened to the Rennicks after they entered the water, the pool did not currently contain what it should contain after 3 years. Either they had passed through the pool into another space, or they were at a depth that prevented normal surfacing, or the water had done something to them that I had no framework for understanding. I stepped back from the edge. "We're going to leave the pool for now," I said. "We'll report what we've found, secure this location, and recommend a full recovery team with dive capability." Alan agreed without hesitation. We prepared to leave the chamber, and I took one last look around the space. The pale blue tarp of the shelter, the neatly placed boots, the crayon drawing under its stone, the dark pool at the far end, still and warm and holding whatever it held, and then I noticed something I'd missed. On the wall above the shelter, high, maybe 15 feet up, there were marks. Not tally marks, not scratches. These were drawn in crayon, the same medium as the child's drawing on the floor. They were faded and small, and I had overlooked them during our initial survey because they were above my natural sight line, on a section of wall that was in deep shadow. I got out my headlamp and aimed it upward. The marks were handprints. Small handprints, child-sized, pressed against the wall in crayon, the way kindergartners make handprints in paint. There were 4 of them, in a row, ascending the wall at intervals of about 2 feet. A child's hand height, then above it, then above that, then above that, as though a child had been moving up the wall. 15 feet above the floor, on vertical sandstone, with no ledge, no foothold, no possible way for a child to have reached that height. Alan saw where my headlamp was pointing. He looked up. I heard his breathing change. "Those weren't in my photographs," he said quietly. "I shot the walls, every wall. I would have seen those." I believed him. We had been thorough. We had documented every surface. And yet here were 4 crayon handprints on a wall we'd both examined, ascending to an impossible height, as clearly present as the tally marks in the slot. Like the barrettes, appearing in spaces we had already searched and found empty. I photographed the handprints. I didn't attempt to climb up to examine them more closely. I wanted to leave this chamber. I wanted to get back to wide-open canyon with sky above me and deliver this evidence to Carla Beckman, and let people with more resources and more authority then I'd decide what to do next. We left through the entrance pool, the cold water a shock after the warm air of the chamber, and moved back through the slot canyon toward our campsite. The walk felt different going out. The canyon was the same narrow walls, the same amber light, the same flat echoes of our footsteps in the shallow water. But I was carrying 47 days of a family's survival in my pack, and the weight of it, not the physical weight. The other kind changed how the canyon felt around me. We didn't speak much on the walk out. The sound of our movement through the water was the only conversation. When we passed the tally marks section, I stopped. I counted the marks again. 48. I counted a second time, carefully, touching each group of 5. 9 groups of 5 and 3 individual marks. 48. Yesterday there had been 47. I had counted twice. I had photographed them. 47. Now there were 48. I looked at Alan. He was counting too, his lips moving silently. "There's a new one," he said. A single fresh scratch at the end of the sequence, slightly lighter in color than the others, the raw sandstone exposed by a new mark, not yet weathered to match the surrounding rock. Someone had added a tally mark to the wall since yesterday afternoon. In a section of canyon, we had been the only people in. In a passage we had walked through twice today and once yesterday. In a slot so narrow that no one could have passed us without our knowledge. A 48th mark. A new day counted. 3 years after the last entry in Michael Rennick's notebook. I photographed the new mark, and we kept walking. We reached our campsite in the wider canyon by late afternoon. The cottonwoods were moving in a light breeze that hadn't been present that morning, and the shifting leaves threw small patterns of shadow across the sandbar where our gear was stowed. The stream murmured past. A canyon wren sang its falling scale from somewhere on the south wall. Everything about the wider canyon was normal and familiar, and I was aware of how much I needed that normalcy. I sat on a flat rock near the stream and opened the topo map. Alan sat across from me, and we went through what we knew, piece by piece. The way you go through any operational situation, facts first, interpretation later. Fact. The Rennicks had been in that chamber. The notebook was primary source documentation. The personal effects were consistent with the family profile. The tally marks matched the day count in the journal. Fact: Sandra Rennick had left the chamber on day 36 and attempted to swim out through the slot canyon. She had not returned to the chamber. She had also never been found anywhere in the 14 miles between the slot and the nearest road. No body, no clothing, no indication that she had made it out of the canyon system at all. Fact: Michael Rennick had taken the two girls into the warm pool at the back of the chamber on day 47. No remains were present in the pool. No remains were present anywhere in the chamber. Fact: The pool water was anomalously warm, with no geological explanation. Fact: Items were appearing in previously searched locations, the barrettes in the alcove, the crayon handprints on the chamber wall. These items were appearing between our visits, in a canyon with no other human traffic. Fact: The tally count had increased by 1 mark overnight, in a location accessible only through the deep slot we'd been working in. I wrote each of these facts in my notebook, numbering them, and then drew a line beneath the list. Below the line, I wrote, unknown. Below that, nothing. Because the interpretation of these facts was not something I was prepared to commit to in pencil. Alan watched me write. When I put the notebook down, he said, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the evidence recovery is straightforward. We have a journal, personal effects, a survival camp, and a location. That's enough for the sheriff's office to organize a full recovery operation. The pool needs to be explored by divers. The chamber needs to be processed by a forensic team. The vehicle still needs to be found. It's presumably somewhere on the road system between Kanab and Escalante." That's the official version. That's the operational reality. And the rest of it? The rest of it is observations I can report but can't explain. Warm water in a geologically inactive canyon. Objects appearing in sealed locations. Tally marks increasing in count. Those go in the report as observed phenomena. What they mean is someone else's determination. Alan picked up a small stone and turned it over in his fingers. "I've been working in these canyons for a long time," he said. "I've seen flash floods rearrange entire drainages overnight. I've seen natural bridges form and collapse. I've seen petroglyphs that are 1,000 years old right next to rifle cartridges from the 1890s. This landscape does things on time scales we don't usually witness. It's always shifting, always changing, but it follows rules. Erosion, deposition, gravity, temperature, physical rules." He set the stone down. "What's happening in that chamber doesn't follow the rules I know." I didn't disagree with him. But I also didn't offer an alternative framework, because I didn't have one. The most honest thing I could say was what I said next. "We have one more full day before we need to start the hike out. I want to use it to search the canyon between here and the slot entrance for any sign of Sandra Rennick. If she swam out of the deep section on day 36, she would have come through the same passage we've been using. If she made it to the wider canyon, she might have left some trace clothing, footprints, marks on the walls. If she didn't make it through the deep water, there might be evidence of that too." Alan agreed. It was the right professional call, and it gave us a concrete task for the following day, something to do with our hands and our training that didn't require us to have answers we didn't possess. We ate dinner as the light faded. The breeze died. The canyon settled into its nighttime quiet, the stream. The occasional call of a night bird, the tick and pop of sandstone releasing the day's heat. I checked the radio. The evening atmospheric conditions sometimes improved reception in the canyons, and I was able to make partial contact with the Escalante office. I transmitted a brief summary: evidence located, recovery team needed, Will advise on exit, and received a broken acknowledgement. Enough to know the message had been received. As full dark arrived, the canyon took on its nighttime character. The walls became black shapes against a slightly less black sky. The stars appeared in the narrow band above us, bright and dense. The stream caught the starlight and held it in thin, shifting lines. I set my sleeping bag on the sandbar and lay on my back, looking up. My body was tired from 2 days of canyon travel. My mind was not tired at all. The notebook was in my pack in its evidence bag. 47 entries. I kept returning to the last one, Michael Rennick's description of the water rising, warming, his daughter hearing something in it, his decision to enter it. Something is in the water that wants us to come to it. He had written that. An engineer, a man who solved problems by understanding systems, a man who had spent 47 days being rigorous and precise and rational, documenting everything with the methodical care of someone who believed that accurate information could save his family. And on the last day, he had walked into warm water in a dark canyon because his 11-year-old daughter told him it wasn't scary. That was the part I couldn't set aside. Not the water, not the anomalous temperature, not the objects appearing where they shouldn't be. The part that stayed with me was the image of a father holding his daughter's hands and walking into something he couldn't understand, because a child's perception of safety was the only compass he had left. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time I knew immediately why. Sound. From up canyon, the same direction as the night before. Not a single vocalization this time. Continuous. Faint. Carried and distorted by the canyon walls, fragmented by distance and reflection and the acoustic complexity of sandstone corridors. But sustained, going on for 10 or 15 seconds at a stretch, pausing, then resuming. It sounded like someone humming. A simple melody, repetitive. The kind of melody a child would hum, not because it was a recognized song, but because it had that quality of simplicity, that narrow tonal range, that unselfconscious rhythm that children produce when they're occupied with something and not thinking about being heard. I lay still and listened. The humming would continue for a while, then stop, then start again. It wasn't getting closer. It wasn't getting farther away. It was just there, present in the canyon's acoustic space, like a radio signal caught at the edge of reception. Alan was awake. I could hear the change in his breathing. "It's been going for about 5 minutes," he whispered. I was awake when it started. Same direction as last night. Same direction, but listen to it. Does that sound like it's coming from the slot? I listened more carefully. He was right. The sound quality wasn't what I'd expect from a voice echoing out of a narrow slot canyon. Slot acoustics produce a specific kind of reverberation, tight, compressed, with rapid reflections that blur the original signal. This sound was cleaner than that. It had space around it, as though whatever was producing it was in a larger volume, a chamber, an amphitheater, an open area. The wider chamber where we'd found the camp. But the chamber was more than 2 miles from our campsite, through sections of Slot Canyon too narrow for sound to propagate cleanly over that distance. The physics didn't support what I was hearing, unless the sound wasn't traveling through the slot at all. I sat up and oriented myself. The canyon we were camped in ran roughly north-south. The slot containing the tally marks and the chamber was a tributary joining from the east. The sound seemed to be coming from the north up the main canyon, not from the eastern tributary. "That's not coming from the slot," I said. "It's coming from up the main drainage." Alan sat up and listened. turning his head slowly the way you do when you're trying to localize a sound source. You're right. It's north of us. Maybe a quarter mile, maybe less. A quarter mile up the main canyon, an area we hadn't explored because our assignment was the eastern tributary. An area that, on the topographic map, showed the main drainage continuing north through alternating wide and narrow sections for several more miles before branching into smaller tributaries near its headwaters. The humming stopped. We waited. 5 minutes, 10. It didn't resume. "First light," I said. "Before we search the tributary for Sandra's trace, I want to walk a quarter mile up the main canyon. Just a quick look." Alan didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was careful. "We're here to document evidence and report. We found the camp. We found the journal. We found the tally marks. We have what we came for. Anything else is beyond our scope." "I know. And I've heard sounds in these canyons at night before that turned out to be nothing. Whine through a pour-off, a rock settling, water dripping into a resonant pothole. I know that too. But you want to look. I want to see if there's anything there. A 10-minute walk in daylight. If the canyon is empty, we turn around and start the search for Sandra's trace in the tributary." He was quiet for a while. "All right, 10 minutes. We didn't sleep again. We sat in our bags and waited for the darkness to lift, which it did with the slow, indirect process that dawn follows in a deep canyon. Not a sunrise, but a gradual brightening of the air itself. The walls emerging from black to gray to their first warm colors as reflected light found its way down from the rim. We broke camp at first light. Everything packed, everything carried. If the search of the main canyon revealed nothing, we'd move directly to the tributary search and then begin the hike out that afternoon. We walked north along the main drainage. The canyon floor was sandy, flat, and easy. The walls were wide apart here, 60 or 70 feet, and the morning light reached the floor in bright angled shafts where the rim profile allowed direct sun. The stream ran beside us, slightly larger here than at our campsite, fed by additional seeps from the canyon walls. Cottonwoods grew in a loose gallery along the water's edge. At about 300 yards, the canyon made a broad curve to the right, and the walls tightened somewhat, not into a slot, but into a narrower corridor, maybe 30 feet wide, with higher walls that cut off the direct morning sun. The stream pooled here in a series of shallow terraces, each one a few inches deep, the water clear over sand and rounded cobbles. I saw something on the sand at the edge of the stream. A footprint, small, bare. A child's foot, pressed into the damp sand at the waterline with the clarity that comes from recent impression. The toes were distinct. The arch was visible. It was a right foot, pointed upstream. I stopped walking and held up my hand. Alan stopped behind me. I knelt beside the print without touching it. The edges were sharp. Sand grains were still settling into the lowest part of the heel impression as I watched the slow, granular collapse that happens within minutes of a print being made in wet sand. This footprint was fresh, not hours old, minutes old. I looked upstream. The canyon continued its gentle curve, the walls rising smooth and unbroken on both sides. No alcoves, no side passages, no place where a person could have come from or retreated to. The stream terraces extended ahead for another 50 or 60 yards before the corridor narrowed further and curved out of sight. There were no other footprints, just this one. A single right foot, child-sized, pointing upstream, pressed into sand that was still settling. Alan crouched beside me. He looked at the print, then at me, then up the canyon. "That's fresh," he said. "Yes." "How fresh?" Minutes. Look at the grain collapse on the heel edge. The sand is still moving. He looked again. He saw it. There's only one, he said. Yes. A person doesn't leave one footprint. No. We scanned the sand in every direction, upstream, downstream, laterally to both walls. The sand was damp and fine, ideal for recording impressions. Our own boot prints were clear and obvious where we'd walked. A barefoot person walking through this area would have left a trail. There was no trail. There was one print. I photographed it with a ruler for scale. The foot was approximately 7 inches long, consistent with a child between 6 and 8 years old. June Rennick had been 7 in 1994. She would have been 10 in 1997, if she were still alive. A 10-year-old's foot would be larger than this. This print matched the size of a 7-year-old. I registered that discrepancy and filed it without trying to resolve it. I want to go farther, I said. Alan stood up. He didn't argue. I think the print had moved past whatever threshold of professional caution had been restraining him. We were no longer operating in a space where normal objections applied. We walked upstream. I moved slowly, scanning the sand and the walls and the water for any additional evidence. The canyon narrowed. The light dimmed. The walls rose higher and pressed closer, though not to slot canyon tightness. We still had 15 to 20 feet of width. At the next pool terrace, I found another footprint. Left foot, same size, bare, fresh, pointed upstream. 20 yards beyond, a right foot again. They were spaced too far apart for a walking stride. 20 yards between them, where a child's normal step would be maybe 18 inches. Each print was isolated. No heel drag, no toe push-off, no companion prints on either side. Just singular impressions in the sand, as though a child were touching down once and then lifting away. We followed 5 of them over a distance of about 100 yards. Right, left, right, left, right. Always pointed upstream, always fresh, always alone. Then the canyon opened again. Not into a chamber this time. Into a natural amphitheater, a roughly circular space about 50 feet across, with walls that curved upward and inward, forming a partial dome overhead. The stream entered through a narrow slit in the far wall and spread across the amphitheater floor in a thin sheet of water, maybe half an inch deep, covering the entire sandstone surface in a reflective film. The film of water caught the light from the narrow opening above and threw it in shifting, rippling patterns across the curved walls. The effect was disorienting. The walls seemed to move, to breathe, the reflected light creating an illusion of fluid motion on solid rock. In the center of the amphitheater, sitting on the wet sandstone, was a pair of children's shoes. White sneakers, small, one of them missing its pink lace. They were placed side by side, neatly, toes pointing toward the slit where the stream entered. They sat in the thin sheet of water, which flowed around them without disturbing their position. The missing pink lace. That was from the shoe found in the Slot Canyon alcove, the shoe that had started this entire investigation. The one Carla Beckman had brought to the district office in an evidence bag. It had one frayed pink lace. This shoe, the matching one. The left foot had no lace at all in its corresponding eyelet. The lace was gone, as though it had been removed and threaded into the other shoe before that shoe was placed in the alcove. A pair, separated, one shoe placed where it would be found, the other here at the end of a trail of impossible footprints, in an amphitheater I hadn't known existed until 5 minutes ago. I stood at the edge of the amphitheater and did not step onto the wet floor. The reflected light played across the walls. The stream whispered through its slit. The shoes sat motionless in the shallow water. "Alan, I see them. I need you to photograph this from where you're standing. Wide angle, then detail. Don't step onto the wet surface." He began shooting. The camera shutter sounded very loud in the enclosed space. While he photographed, I studied the amphitheater. The walls were smooth, curved, unbroken. No alcoves, no cracks, no shelves. The floor was a single sheet of sandstone, barely concave, collecting the stream water into that thin reflective film. The slit where the stream entered was narrow, maybe 8 inches wide. A vertical crack in the rock extending from floor to ceiling, too narrow for any person to pass through. No way in except the way we'd come. No way out except back the way we'd come. No footprints on the wet sandstone floor. The shoes sat there as though they'd been placed by hands that left no trace. I made a decision that I have thought about many times since. I stepped onto the wet floor and walked to the shoes. The water was cold, normal canyon stream cold, not the anomalous warmth of the chamber pool. It barely covered the soles of my boots. The sandstone beneath was textured with fine ripple marks, providing good traction. I left clear, wet boot prints behind me on the sections of floor that were only damp rather than submerged. I reached the shoes and knelt beside them. Up close, they were in remarkably good condition for objects that had supposedly been in a canyon environment for 3 years. The canvas was faded, but not deteriorated. The rubber soles were intact. They looked like shoes that had been worn for a season and then set aside. Not like shoes that had endured 3 years of flash floods, UV exposure, and temperature cycling. And they were dry inside, sitting in a 1/2-inch sheet of flowing water and dry inside. I picked up the left shoe, the one without a lace, and turned it over. On the inside of the tongue, written in blue ink that had faded but was still legible, was a name. June. I set the shoe down gently. I placed both shoes in a large evidence bag, sealed it, and walked back to Alan at the amphitheater's edge. My boot prints were the only marks on the wet floor. We stood there for a moment without speaking. The reflected light continued to move across the walls. Then, from the narrow slit where the stream entered that 8-inch crack in the rock, too small for any person, I heard the humming again. Close. Not distant and distorted the way it had been at night. Close, clear, and unmistakable. A simple melody, a few notes, repeated with the absent-minded ease of a child humming while engaged in something else. The sound came from behind the rock, from whatever space lay beyond that slit, carried perfectly by the water and the stone. I walked to the slit and put my ear close to it. The humming was right there, inches away, on the other side of the wall. I could feel the faintest movement of air through the crack, warm and damp, as though something was breathing through it. The humming stopped, and then a voice. High, clear, young. One word. Hi. I stepped back from the slit. The amphitheater was silent. The water flowed. The light rippled. Alan was standing exactly where I'd left him, his camera at his side. His face expressionless, in the way that people's faces go when they've heard something they're not equipped to process. You heard that, I said. Yes. I waited 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. No more sound came from the slit. Just the quiet rush of water and the movement of light. I walked back to Alan, and we left the amphitheater. We walked in silence back down the main canyon, past the isolated footprints, which were still there, still sharp-edged in the damp sand, past our former campsite, and into the tributary canyon that led to the slot. I had made a decision while walking. and I told Alan what it was. "We're going back to the chamber. One more time. I want to check the pool." He stopped walking. "Check it how?" "I have the rope. 120 feet of static line. I'm going to lower a weighted end into the pool and find the bottom. That's it. Just a depth measurement. Then we leave." "Why?" "Because the journal says the water was rising. If it's been rising for 3 years, the depth now might tell us something about the rate. And if there's a bottom at a measurable depth, that changes the recovery operation. They'll know what they're dealing with." It was a reasonable professional justification for what was, if I'm being honest, a decision driven by something less rational. I wanted to go back to the chamber because the chamber was the center of this. And I had the feeling, not a professional assessment, a feeling that I had missed something. Alan considered it. "One measurement, then we leave. One measurement, then we leave." We re-entered the slot. The walk to the tally marks took about 40 minutes. When we reached them, I counted. 49, another new mark, added since we'd passed through that morning. The fresh scratch was bright against the weathered stone, clearly recent, at the end of the sequence. I photographed it, and we continued to the chamber. Everything was as we'd left it. The shelter, the objects, the evidence we'd already collected gone from its original positions. The chamber was cool and still and quiet. The crayon handprints on the upper wall were still there. 4 small, colorful marks ascending the vertical sandstone toward the ceiling. I walked to the back pool. It was larger, not dramatically, maybe 6 inches wider on each side than it had been the previous day, but I had measured the pool's width in my notebook. 6 feet across at the water line. Now it was closer to 7. The water had risen and expanded laterally, creeping forward across the sand floor toward the shelter. And it was warmer. I didn't need to touch it to know I could feel the warmth radiating from the surface, the way you can feel the heat from a bathtub when you're standing beside it. I touched the water anyway. 85 degrees. Maybe 90. Warm enough that you would notice it immediately. Warm enough that the word comfortable applied without qualification. I tied a carabiner to the end of my rope as a weight and lowered it into the pool. The rope played out through my gloves. 10 feet, 20, 30. The carabiner hadn't touched bottom. 40 feet, 50. At 52 feet, the rope went slack. Not the sudden stop of hitting a solid bottom. Slack, as though the carabiner had been caught by something gently held rather than obstructed. The rope didn't continue to pay out, but it didn't have the firm resistance of a stone floor either. It had the quality of tension you feel when something living is holding the other end. I froze. My hands on the rope registered a faint vibration, rhythmic, slow, the same aspirated pulse I'd heard in the slot. The rope was transmitting it. Whatever was at 52 feet of depth was moving in that rhythm. I pulled. The rope came freely, no resistance, as though whatever had held it had simply let go. The carabiner emerged from the water clean and dry, which shouldn't have been possible. It had been submerged in water, and it was dry. Alan was watching from across the chamber. What happened? The line went to 52 feet, and something held it. Held it? Not snagged. Held, then released. He looked at the pool, then at me, then at the pool again. 52 feet, he said. This canyon is in Navajo sandstone over Kayenta. The Kayenta layer here is maybe 20, 25 feet below the chamber floor based on what we saw in the slot. Below the Kayenta is the Wingate Formation, then the Chinle. You'd have to go through 3 geological formations to get 52 feet of open water below this chamber. That's not a pool. That's a shaft. He was right. The geology didn't support a 52-foot deep pool in this location. There was no known mechanism for a vertical shaft of that depth in this stratigraphy. Solution cavities exist in limestone, but this wasn't limestone. This was sandstone over shale over sandstone. These formations don't produce shafts. But the rope had gone to 52 feet, and something had held it. I coiled the rope and secured it to my pack. My hands were steady. My breathing was measured. I was operating within the framework of my training. Observe, document, report, and I intended to stay within that framework, regardless of what the evidence seemed to suggest. "We're done here," I said. We left the chamber for the last time. As I passed through the cold entrance pool into the slot, I turned and looked back. The chamber was dim, lit only by the faint reflected glow from the slot entrance. The shelter was a pale shape against the far wall. The dark pool at the back of the chamber was a black mirror, reflecting nothing. And on its surface I saw this clearly. And Alan saw it too, because I heard him stop breathing on its surface. There were ripples. Not from the edges inward, the way ripples spread from a disturbance at the shore. From the center outward. Something had disturbed the surface from below. Something was moving up. We left. I am not ashamed of the pace at which we moved through the slot. We were not running. You cannot run in a slot canyon without risking a broken ankle or worse. But we moved with a sustained urgency that exceeded anything resembling a normal hiking pace. We were through the slot, past the tally marks. I did not stop to count them through the wider canyon sections and at the base of the rim access trail by late afternoon. The climb out was the hardest part. 800 feet of elevation gain on tired legs with full packs in the heat of the day. We stopped twice to drink water, and once when Alan's foot slipped on a sandstone ledge and he caught himself on his hands, scraping both palms. He wrapped them with gauze from his first aid kit without complaint, and we continued. When we reached the rim, the landscape opened around us, the vast, rolling expanse of slick rock and sage that characterizes the Escalante region. The Henry Mountains blew in the distance, the sky enormous and empty above us. The late afternoon sun was warm on my face. The wind carried the smell of dust and juniper. I stood at the rim and looked back down into the canyon. From up here, it was just a dark line in the rock, a narrow shadow cutting through the pale sandstone, revealing nothing of its depth or contents. You could drive past this spot on a dirt road and never think twice about the crack in the earth beside you. I made a radio call from the truck. Full reception on the rim. I reached the Escalante office and gave a concise summary. The Rennick family camp had been located. A primary document had been recovered. Evidence indicated the family had entered a subterranean water feature within the canyon. A full recovery team with dive capability was recommended. I gave coordinates, access route descriptions, and an estimate of the equipment needed. The dispatcher asked if there were any survivors. I paused. The question was standard. The answer should have been straightforward. No survivors were directly observed, I said. But the site should be treated as an active search area. I don't know why I said it that way. Every piece of evidence indicated that the Rennicks had been in that canyon 3 years ago. The journal ended on day 47. The camp had been abandoned. The pool was whatever the pool was. There was no rational basis for treating this as anything other than a recovery operation for remains. But the footprints in the sand had been minutes old. The voice through the slit had said a word. The shoes had been dry inside while sitting in water. The tally marks were still being counted. Something in that canyon was present tense, not past. I drove Alan back to the Escalante office. He was quiet for most of the drive, looking out the window at the desert. When we arrived, he got out and stood by the truck for a moment before going inside. "I need to ask you something," he said. "When you lowered the rope into the pool and something held it, what did it feel like?" I thought about how to answer honestly. "It felt gentle," I said. "Whatever was holding the rope wasn't pulling. It wasn't aggressive. It just held on, like a hand resting on something." He nodded slowly. Then he went inside. I delivered the evidence to Carla Beckman the following day. The notebook, the barrettes, the shoes, the Swiss Army knife, the photographs, the sketches, the measurements. She spread it all across the same desk where she'd first shown me the shoe, and went through it piece by piece with the thoroughness of a detective who'd been carrying an unsolved case for 3 years. She read the notebook in its entirety while I sat across from her. I watched her face as she reached the final entry. She didn't cry. She set the notebook down carefully and placed both hands flat on the desk, the way you do when you need to feel something solid. 47 days, she said. Yes. In a canyon we never searched. 14 miles from the highway, in a space you can only reach on foot through a slot canyon. Yes. How did they get there? They were in a vehicle. A family with 2 young children doesn't hike 14 miles into a slot canyon. The journal describes them walking into a side canyon from a highway pullout. If they entered from the Highway 12 corridor near the Escalante River crossing, there are canyon systems that could connect to the tributary where we found the camp. The route wouldn't be 14 miles as the crow flies. It would be shorter through the canyon system, maybe 6 or 7 miles of walking. Enough for a family on a day hike that went too far. And the vehicle? Presumably at a pullout near the canyon entrance. If it's still there, 3 years of weather and blowing sand may have partially buried it, or someone may have reported it and it was towed as abandoned. That's a records check. She wrote a note. Then she looked up. The pool, the warm water, the rope being held at 52 feet, the voice you and Alan heard, the footprints. How do I put that in a report? You don't, I said. You report the physical evidence, the camp, the journal, the personal effects, the location. You recommend a recovery operation with dive capability. The anomalous observations go in my field notes as exactly what they are, observations that I documented but cannot explain. And if the dive team goes in and finds nothing, then the report reflects that. And the family? The family was in that canyon. Michael Rennick's journal proves it. What happened after day 47 is what the recovery operation is designed to determine. She nodded. She was a professional. She understood the boundary between what an investigation documents and what it explains. But she asked one more question. The voice, through the crack in the rock. You said it said one word. Yes. What word? Hi. She was quiet for a long time after that. I stayed in Escalante for 3 more days, writing my field report and assisting Carla with the logistics of the recovery operation. She moved quickly. The journal and physical evidence were enough to reclassify the Rennick case from cold missing persons to active recovery, which unlocked county resources and justified a mutual aid request to the state. A 6-person team was assembled. 2 sheriff's deputies with backcountry experience, a forensic specialist from the state crime lab in Salt Lake City, 2 technical rescue divers from a search and rescue unit based in Grand County who had experience with confined water operations, and Alan, who would guide them in. I was not part of the recovery team. My assignment had been the initial search and evidence collection, and that was complete. Carla asked if I wanted to go back in, and I told her I'd be available if they needed consultation, but that the operation should be run by her people with her authority. That was the truth. It was also true that I was not eager to return to that chamber. I did two things before leaving Escalante. First, I went to the county recorder's office and searched property records and vehicle registrations for the Highway 12 corridor near the Escalante River crossing. It took most of a morning. What I found was a brief notation in a Utah Highway Patrol log from September 1994, 3 months after the Rennicks disappeared. A dark green Ford Explorer with Arizona plates had been reported as an abandoned vehicle at a pullout approximately 2 miles west of the Escalante River Bridge on Highway 12. The vehicle had been towed to an impound lot in Garfield County. The plates had been run, but at the time, the Rennick missing persons case was being coordinated out of Kane County Kanab's jurisdiction, and the information hadn't been cross-referenced. The vehicle had been sitting in an impound lot for 3 years, 70 miles from the sheriff's office that was searching for it. That is not an unusual failure. It's the kind of thing that happens when a case spans multiple jurisdictions in a rural area with limited communication infrastructure. It's the kind of thing that, if it had been caught in 1994, might have redirected the search to the correct area within days of the family's disappearance. I include it not to assign blame, but to acknowledge the reality that the systems we rely on are imperfect, and that imperfection has consequences measured in human lives. Carla received this information with the particular stillness of someone absorbing a fact they will carry for a long time. The second thing I did was drive to the pullout where the Explorer had been found. It was a small gravel parking area on the south side of Highway 12, overlooking a shallow canyon that dropped toward the Escalante River drainage. A wooden sign marked the beginning of a hiking route, not a maintained trail, just a route designation. A dotted line on the map indicating a path that experienced hikers could follow through the canyon system. I stood at the edge of the pullout and looked down into the canyon. It was beautiful. Late afternoon light on red sandstone, the green thread of vegetation along the drainage bottom, the layered walls stepping down in terraces toward the river. I could see exactly why a family would stop here. I could see exactly why a father with a road map and a sense of adventure would decide to walk a little way into that canyon with his wife and daughters. The canyon entrance was wide and inviting. The first few hundred yards were easy walking, a gentle sandy slope, scattered cottonwoods, the sound of water somewhere below. Everything about it said, "Come in." Just a little farther, just around the next bend. That is what canyons do. They draw you forward with the promise that each turn will reveal something you haven't seen yet. And they're always right. Each turn does reveal something new. The problem is that the return trip is never as simple as the approach. And by the time you realize how deep you've gone, the easy walk has become a commitment. I didn't enter the canyon. I stood at the rim and looked at it and thought about Michael Rennick loading his daughter's backpacks, and Sandra checking the map, and Olivia asking how far they were going, and June holding someone's hand. Then I drove back to Escalante and finished my report. The recovery team went in 4 days after I came out. I wasn't there, but I received Carla's account of the operation later, and I reviewed the official report when it was filed. I'll relay what they found, with the understanding that this is second-hand and filtered through institutional language that was, I believe, carefully chosen to document facts while avoiding conclusions that the facts themselves seem to resist. The team reached the chamber without difficulty, following the route Alan and I had established. They confirmed the camp, the shelter, the personal items, and the pool. The forensic specialist processed the camp as a scene, collecting trace evidence, including hair samples from the sleeping areas, fabric fibers, and residue from the cooking pot. These were later confirmed as consistent with the Rennick family through comparison with samples obtained from the family's home in Tempe. The divers conducted a preliminary survey of the pool. This is where the report becomes notable for what it doesn't say as much as what it does. The divers reported that the pool was approximately 9 feet deep. The bottom was flat sandstone, clearly visible, with a thin layer of fine sediment. The water temperature was measured at 71 degrees Fahrenheit warm for a canyon pool, but not dramatically so. The pool was described as a simple closed basin with no outlet, no shaft, no continuation of any kind. The walls went down, met the floor, and stopped 9 feet deep. Flat bottom, closed basin. When I had lowered my rope 4 days earlier, it had gone to 52 feet without touching bottom, and something had held it. I read that section of the report 3 times. Then I called Carla. "The pool," I said. 9 feet? That's what the divers measured. I put 52 feet of rope into that pool and didn't reach the bottom. There was a long pause. "I know what your report says. I know what their report says. I don't have an explanation for the discrepancy." Did the divers note anything unusual? They noted the water temperature. They described the bottom as normal sandstone with sediment. They found no remains, no personal effects, no biological material. The pool was, and this is the word they used, unremarkable. Was it still warm? 71 degrees, warmer than expected, but within a range they attributed to the enclosed environment and possible geothermal seepage through the Kayenta layer. There's no geothermal activity in that area. I know. They noted it as possible, not confirmed. And the water level? When Alan and I were there, the pool was expanding. It had grown 6 inches on each side overnight. The divers measured the pool at approximately 6 feet across, consistent with your initial measurement, not the expanded measurement from your second visit. 6 feet, the original width. As though the expansion I documented had reversed itself, as though the pool had returned to its previous dimensions before the recovery team arrived. What about the tally marks? 47. Alan counted them on the way in. 47. 47. Not 48. Not 49. The additional marks I documented, photographed, recorded, verified by both Alan and myself, were gone. The walls showed 47 weathered scratches, matching the original count, matching the day count in the journal. No fresh marks. No bright, unweathered scratches at the end of the sequence. I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and felt something shift in my understanding. Not a dramatic revelation, a quiet rearrangement. The chamber had presented itself to the recovery team as a straightforward, if tragic, scene. A family survival camp. A journal documenting 47 days of entrapment. A pool that was warm but shallow, empty, unremarkable. A case that could be understood and filed and closed. Everything anomalous. The depth, the warmth, the expanding water, the increasing tally marks, the objects appearing in searched spaces, the footprints, the voice, all of it had been present only when Alan and I were there. Only during our investigation. As though the canyon had shown us something it did not intend to show anyone else. Or as though something in the canyon had been trying to communicate with us specifically, and had withdrawn that effort when different people arrived. I don't know which interpretation is correct. I don't know if either is correct. I am telling you what the evidence showed and what the subsequent investigation found. And I'm acknowledging the gap between the two without attempting to bridge it. The recovery operation was officially concluded after 3 days in the canyon. No human remains were recovered. The campsite was fully documented, and the personal effects were collected as evidence. The journal was entered into the case file. The Ford Explorer was retrieved from the impound lot and processed inside it. They found the family's camping gear, road maps, a cooler with long decomposed food, and a disposable camera with 12 exposed frames. The photographs, when developed, showed the Rennick family at the Grand Canyon, at a roadside lookout near Page, and at the Kanab Motel. The last 3 frames showed the entrance to a canyon, red walls, blue sky, a sandy wash leading inward. In one of these photographs, 2 small figures were visible walking ahead on the sand, their shadows stretching behind them in the late morning light. The case was reclassified. The official determination was that the Rennick family had become trapped in a canyon tributary of the Escalante River drainage and had perished due to exposure, dehydration, and starvation after approximately 47 days. The absence of remains was attributed to flash flood action over the intervening 3-year period, which could have transported biological material through the canyon system and deposited it over a wide area. This explanation was plausible. It was also, in my professional opinion, incomplete. But the report did not ask for my professional opinion on the completeness of its conclusions, and I did not volunteer it. Carla Beckman retired from the sheriff's office in 2001. Before she left, she sent me a copy of the final case file with a handwritten note on the inside cover. It said, "The pool was 9 feet deep when they measured it. I believe you that it was 52 when you measured it." I don't understand what that means. I'm not sure anyone is supposed to. I kept the note. I still have it. Alan Hirsch continued working in the Escalante area for several more years. I spoke with him once, about 18 months after the investigation, when I was passing through southern Utah on another assignment. We had coffee at a diner in Escalante and talked about various things: his work, mine, mutual contacts in the search and rescue community. Near the end of the conversation, he brought up the canyon. "I went back," he said, "last October, by myself." I waited. The chamber was the same. The shelter's still there, nobody's removed it. The pool was there. Cold. I put my hand in it, and it was cold. 50 degrees, maybe. Normal. And the tally marks? 47. "Did you go to the amphitheater? Up the main canyon?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I went to where the amphitheater should have been. The canyon curves right, narrows to about 30 feet, and then it just keeps going. Same width, same character. No amphitheater. No wider section, no dome, no water on the floor. I walked a mile past where we found the shoes, and it was just canyon. Regular canyon. No footprints, no shoes, nothing. The amphitheater is gone. It was never there. That's what the geology says. I looked at the walls, the stratigraphy, the erosion patterns. There's no mechanism for a domed chamber in that section. The canyon doesn't do that there." He drank his coffee. "But I was in it. I stood in it. I watched you pick up those shoes. I heard that voice through the crack in the wall." "So did I. So what was it?" I told him what I tell myself, which is the only honest answer I've been able to arrive at. "I don't know." He accepted that. We finished our coffee and he went back to work, and I went back to mine. There is a temptation, with a story like this, to shape it into something that resolves. To find the thread that connects every piece of evidence into a coherent narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an end. The footprints were this. The voice was that. The pool was some explicable phenomenon, and the family met a fate that, while tragic, fits within the boundaries of what we accept as possible. I've spent years with this case in the back of my mind, and I can construct that narrative if I choose to. Flash floods explain the missing remains. Acoustic anomalies explain the sounds. The warm water was a transient geothermal event. The footprints were a misidentification, some desert animal whose track I misread in poor light. The barrettes were carried by pack rats. The voice was wind through a crack. Each of those explanations is individually plausible. Taken together, they require me to believe that every anomalous observation I made during 3 days in that canyon was a coincidence or a misperception. That everything Alan and I experienced independently confirmed by both of us, photographed, documented, measured, was a chain of errors by 2 experienced professionals operating in good conditions, with clear minds. I don't believe that. But I also can't tell you what I do believe, because I don't have a framework for it. I have observations. I have evidence. I have a journal written by a father who walked into warm water with his daughters because a child told him it was safe. The one thing I come back to, the thing that sits differently from all the others, is the voice. Hi, one word. Through a crack in sandstone, from a space that apparently doesn't exist when other people look for it. Spoken in the voice of a child, clearly, without fear, without distress. As though someone was simply acknowledging that we were there. I've worked in wilderness for most of my adult life. I've seen what the natural world can do to people and what it can hide from them. I've found lost hikers, and I've found remains, and I've found campsites where the story ended in ways I could piece together from the evidence. Every one of those cases, no matter how difficult, eventually made sense within a framework I understood. People get lost. People get hurt. The wilderness is unforgiving of mistakes, and sometimes unforgiving of no mistake at all. That's the reality I've operated in. And it's sufficient for almost everything I've encountered. Almost. The Escalante case doesn't fit. The chamber and the pool and the amphitheater and the voice don't fit within what I know about how the world works. And the recovery team's findings, the shallow pool, the absent amphitheater, the original tally count, suggest that whatever Alan and I encountered was not a permanent feature of that canyon. It was present for us, and that it wasn't present for anyone else. I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what conclusion it supports. I've turned it over for years, and the best I can offer is this. Something in that canyon was still present after 3 years. Not the family, or not only the family. Something that knew we were there. That placed evidence where we would find it. That led us through footprints, to shoes, to a voice. Something that wanted to be found, or at least wanted to be acknowledged. And when the acknowledgement happened, when we stood in that amphitheater and heard a child's voice say a single word through a crack in the rock, it was satisfied. It withdrew. It returned the canyon to its default state, its measurable, unremarkable, 9-foot-deep state. And it let the official record reflect a tragedy that could be filed and eventually closed. But it said hi to us first. 2 years after the recovery operation, I received a package in the mail at my duty station, no return address. Inside was a child's drawing crayon on paper, folded twice. It showed 4 stick figures standing in blue water up to their waists. The figures were smiling. Above them, in the careful, oversized lettering of a young child, were 2 words. We're okay. I never found out who sent it. The postmark was from a small town in southern Utah that I'd never been to. I contacted Carla, who was already retired. She had no explanation. I contacted Alan. He had received nothing. I kept the drawing. It's in a box with the other things from that period of my career: field notebooks, topo maps, photographs. the accumulated evidence of decades spent in places where the land keeps its own counsel. I didn't frame it. I didn't show it to anyone. But I didn't throw it away, either. Some things you carry not because you understand them, but because putting them down feels like a kind of abandonment. Like turning your back on someone who went to the trouble of telling you they're all right. The Escalante canyons are still there. They're still beautiful. People hike through them every year, following the routes that pass within a few miles of the tributary where the Rennicks made their camp. The slot is still narrow and deep and quiet. The wider canyon still has its cottonwoods and its wrens and its stream that appears and disappears as the terrain shifts. Whether the amphitheater is still there depends, I think, on who's looking and what they're willing to find. I haven't gone back, not because I'm afraid, because the canyon showed me what it wanted to show me, and asking for more feels like a kind of ingratitude. A child said hi to me from inside the rock, and some part of me has never left that amphitheater. Standing in half an inch of cold water, listening to the echo of a voice that had no reason to exist and no obligation to speak, but spoke anyway. That's where I'll leave it.